Chapter 11 The Possibilities. You are listening at Novel Full. Audio. Now Xavier didn't know much about these creatures, but even he knew that goblins were typically known as annoying creatures. They were classic pranksters and constantly annoyed humans. They were exceptionally good at creeping up on humans and attacking them. They were especially fond of sneaking up on hunters who were alone on hunting trips. This was one of their favorite tactics. Goblins were also disorganized, so they sucked at coordinating massacres and attacks on a grand scale. They flopped seriously in this regard, so they preferred sneaking up on lone hunters or single humans on the roads or in the woods. They were well known for this. However, this particular trait of theirs didn't make them less dangerous. In fact, it was quite the opposite. Goblins were bloodthirsty creatures who lived to gore and cause destruction. They could usually be found stalking the woods or lonely highways in small clusters or sometimes, one single or more. But they could also be cowards sometimes. Whenever they came across difficulties during an attack, they were quick to abandon their objective to flee. It was primitive instinct in them because it was their nature. They absolutely hated altercations that droned on for long periods of time. When often met with fierce resistance, the monsters simply turned around and ran. Xavier's mind went to work immediately. His training as a member of the Special Forces unit covered virtually everything there was to know about killing. It wasn't sadistic, neither was sycophantic, it was just what had been ingrained in him. It also wasn't just about killing. Xavier knew that strategic planning and mental preparedness was 60.5% of the job. So when he heard the summary of what the mission entailed, he began to strategize on the best possible way to locate, infiltrate and kill the head of the goblins. A part of Xavier was still finding it really hard to accept this as his reality. Not too long away his life had been perfectly normal, and then in the blink of an eye, he had been yanked out of the comfort of his daily routine and dropped off in this strange world. It all seemed like a dream, he almost felt like it was a simulation. But then again, he remembered all the times he had come dangerously close to death in the very short time he was here. The incident with the cheetah had been one of those. He could still remember the crushing vivid details of that night. The decapitated head of the animal which he had traded in only a few minutes ago served as the perfect reminder. He quickly set aside his doubts and got into strategy mode. Killing a lone wild animal was one thing. Having to kill off a whole goblin who happened to be a gang leader was a different ball game altogether. He needed all the information he could get ahead of time. Caden had been watching him closely. The old man didn't take his eyes off Xavier for a second. In that very moment, Caden would have given half his fortune just so he could get an insight to what was going on this stranger's head. There was a certain flame in Xavier's eyes that Caden coveted. He looked down on youths generally, but Xavier was a different breed. The old cunning magician looked forward to having him around. It would be fun to unravel the mysteries of his strange aura and incredible strength. Xavier sighed inwardly. All he wanted was to just retire to a safe and quiet place where he could enjoy the comfort of solitude. And yet, because of system, he had no other option but to accept this peculiar mission. Xavier's clear string voice suddenly came out of the blue and disrupted Caden's maniacal plans. Details. I need details. Unable to fully mask his excitement, Caden clapped his hands delightfully as his eyes tingled with expectation. Wonderful. I take it that you've decided to accept the mission. Not wanting to risk Xavier retracting his statement, he continued to speak hurriedly, as if he was scared that Xavier would change his mind. I am glad you asked for more information. You see, I have dealt with a lot of blockhead hunters in the past. Most of them just charge in blindly after receiving their tasks. Few ask for more information. Even fewer make ample use of the information given. He paused for a bit and continued, but I am glad that you are asking. We're off to a pretty good start. Xavier was getting increasingly irritated by the old man's unnecessary ramblings. What kind of hunter delves right into a capture/kill mission without first assessing the risks and gleaning the much-needed information? This information Caden had so willingly dropped off on Xavier showed the class of crude thoughtless idiots the old magician had been working with. Also, it was evident to Xavier that the older man loved the sound of his own voice. Xavier absolutely detested conversations that demanded excess words. The only time he tolerated elaborate speeches was when a superior would debrief him on an upcoming mission. Other than that, he never really got around to enduring superfluous speeches. Xavier knew that the compulsive need to share too much was often a symptom of chronic liars and manipulators. Right now, the man who stood before him was actively displaying all the signs. He knew he had to watch the old man. Unaware of the thoughts going on in Xavier's mind, the magician delved right into explaining some details that Xavier needed to successfully complete his mission. First off, my dear Xavier, you need to recognize the terrain. I don't know where you're from, but the landscape where the goblins reside is typically steep. There's a lot of high ground around the road in the mountain pass, and I must confess that this proves very advantageous to the nasty creatures. They have been known to jump down from terrifying heights and descend on unwary travelers and hunters. He observed Xavier very closely as he dropped the last part. As expected, Xavier showed no signs of fear. He pressed on. The surrounding areas are mostly woods and dense forests. Xavier tensed a bit at the mention of the word forest. He wasn't a big fan of forests in this strange place. But fortunately for him, Caden had given up on trying to read him. The old magician was too absorbed in his own lecture that he didn't see Xavier's reaction. The goblins themselves move in groups. But sometimes, you can catch an Omega wandering on his own. The leader of this particular gang of goblins is a shifty one. He never strikes in the same location twice. So, it's safe to say that he is a nasty piece of work. Not that it would faze you anyway. He winked at Xavier as he said that. Also, I don't know if you know this, but goblins have an inclination towards cowardice when overwhelmed. When faced with risk, the tendency of them running is much higher than that of them risking their necks. He chuckled as he gave up that last bit of information. This particular trait of theirs can be annoying really. Especially for someone like you who is on a mission to destroy their leader. It can be pretty difficult to kill a monster who loves its own life that it would rather flee than fight. Beware though, their numbers can make them pretty strong. Many a hunter have been known to be overwhelmed by the sheer vastness of just a single colony of goblins. Xavier absorbed the information at the speed of light. Some of what Caden had said confirmed what he already suspected about goblins. The knowledge of the terrain would prove helpful to him though. He never would have been able to guess that before the hand. Having received all the necessary information that pertained to goblins, he set off without even saying a word. Caden watched him curiously as he evacuated the office. The dialogue between them wasn't what he had expected. While he was still ruminating on this, the waitress who had handled the transaction emerged with a worried look on her face. She was actually the one who had alerted Caden when she saw the stranger. It was for this very purpose that she had delayed the payment. Not bothering with all the elaborate niceties, she accosted the old man with a barrage of questions. What do you think? Is he really just an ordinary dude? Caden didn't answer her right away. He was very much still in deep thought. Then finally, he spoke up, he is everything and more. I see a lot of potential in that young man. The possibilities are endless. Chapter 12 Ambush. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Xavier's mind was on top form. Once again, his entire focus was centered on accomplishing his mission. Once Xavier had a task to fulfill, he was like a bloodhound on a hunting trip. This was pretty ironic because right now, he was on an actual hunting trip. This was what he lived for. This was what he was trained to do. As he set out on the mission, Xavier began to fully understand the importance of being equipped for such a dangerous endeavor. He needed supplies more than ever before. He wasn't completely familiar with the town, so he didn't know where to go to obtain a regular sniper's rifle and a silencer. He pondered on this for a while before he remembered the military system. He stopped abruptly in the middle of his thoughts. I was rewarded with points by the system the last time. Then came the next logical thought that accompanied the first: I wonder if I can exchange points for assault weapons. An AR.15 and a Glock 47 with a silencer wouldn't be bad right now. He still wasn't completely sure if he could redeem points for weapons, but he went ahead anyway. Whichever way, he was bound to find out anyway. He was on the highway, so he ducked into the bushes to communicate with the system. He didn't put it past the old man to set a spy on him. Xavier knew he'd do the same if the roles were reversed. From a clearing behind the bushes, he scanned his surroundings to make sure that he wasn't followed. Convinced that he wasn't, Xavier spoke aloud to the military system saying, "Military system, come online." It responded immediately. Affirmative. Systems online. He then asked his request, "I want to redeem my points for weapons." It took a while, but then the system finally answered. Roger that, Major. State the caliber of weapons you desire. Xavier half expected it not to be true. But it turned out to be the complete opposite. Not only could he redeem points for weapons, it turned out that he could actually make requests for specific weapons. He thought for a minute, so as to not hastily make a wrong decision. As a seasoned veteran, he assessed the situation and understood that his best bet was a long-range sniper's rifle. Since his goal wasn't to massacre an entire group of goblins, he knew that a sniper's rifle was the ideal weapon. This was an assassination, so he planned to position himself from afar and kill the gang leader of the goblins without actually inciting a ruckus. It was a good plan. He also knew that he had to have a silencer in order to keep it silent and not give up his location. He swallowed gingerly and made his request to the system: "I would like a fully loaded sniper's rifle, along with a silencer and sufficient ammo." The system wasted no time in providing his needs. Xavier welcomed the new toys with great joy. Even he shocked himself by how happy new weapons made him. With his weapons secured, Xavier's training kicked in and he began to make preparations for the perfect camouflage. He harvested a decent helping of weed and padded himself with the grass. With all this in place, and with the stealth of a hunter, Xavier carefully made his way towards the goblins' territory. Every step he took was calculated. He even regulated his breathing just so he could remain incognito. The game was afoot. Amidst all the qualities of the goblins that Caden had so graciously taken out time to explain, one very peculiar trait stood out the most: they were completely 100 bloodthirsty creatures that lacked any form of compassion. At their core, they had zero compassion for just about any other creature that wasn't of their race. Goblins were known to have torn apart little children that wandered into the woods. They were also famous for descending in bands on travelers and lone hunters who were unfortunate to get themselves caught off guard. Their heinous crimes were all pointers to the fact that they hadn't even the tiniest shred of empathy. Compassion was a completely alien concept to them. There were nature's perfect examples of narcissistic and self-absorption. They only existed for one clear definitive purpose only: to go through life indulging their appetites and cravings only. As a race, their behavioral pattern was synonymous to cowards and mad men. It was that simple. Xavier soon arrived at the location that the old man had described earlier on. He took out his night vision goggles that doubled as binoculars and scanned the landscape before him. It was evening time and dusk was at least a few hours away. He noticed no movements whatsoever. So he climbed to a higher ground and hid himself in a shrub of weeds. Having found the perfect hiding spot, all he had to do was wait for the leader to appear. Xavier wasn't sure how long this was going to take. He never for once believed in luck, and yet he hoped against hope that his luck would turn around and bring him the leader of the goblins. As a member of the Special Forces, Xavier had often heard tales from professional snipers who claimed to have waited as long as 40.8 hours for their targets to appear. This required an extreme amount of calmness and patience. It wasn't just the ability to remain calm, it was the ability to maintain a cool head, and at the same time, stay perfectly alert. Striking the balance was key. An astute sniper had to remain calm at all times and also remain vigilant. Staying at the same position for hours on end while waiting for a target, that may or may not show, required a certain kind of skill. This also meant that snipers couldn't go for bathroom breaks, neither could they stop for a snack, and it also invariably meant that sleeping wasn't an option. This high level of tension could very well affect the mind of a regular person who hadn't received proper training for this. Xavier was one of those few who could handle the strain. At the core of his being, he was also a calm person. He possessed all the qualities that made for a good sniper. He never moved an inch. Sooner than expected, Xavier began to detect goblin activity in the environment. As he had expected, they slowly began to emerge as dusk came. Chapter 13 New set of instructions. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Xavier held his breath and kept watch. A few minutes later, one of the goblins ventured close to Xavier's hiding place. It was a mean-looking dirty goblin that was relatively smaller than the others. It emerged from the bushes right behind Xavier and strolled right over his head. Xavier remained perfectly still and stayed motionless, not daring to even glance at it to see if it had spotted him. What happened next was something that Xavier could never have been fully prepared for. Completely oblivious of the human hidden in the bushes before it, the goblin let out its massive organ and released a stream of hot stinking urine right on Xavier's head. The poor guy was mortified. Because he could do absolutely nothing but remain static at the moment, Xavier allowed the putrid, highly concentrated, and stinky acidic urine to bathe his head with golden showers. It soaked through his beret and poured down his eyes, nose and mouth until Xavier couldn't just smell it, but literally taste it on his lips. It was a horrifying experience. And yet, Xavier retained his professionalism. His eyes never left the scope of the sniper as he waited patiently for the leader to emerge. As if Xavier's humiliation wasn't enough, after the dirty creature had emptied its bladder, it grunted and farted. It was a strong odor that saturated the surrounding and polluted it drastically. Although Xavier didn't know it for sure, he suspected that the foul-smelling gas was enough to choke a small mouse to death. The foul gas that escaped from the goblin's bowels was that strong. The very concept of time is relative. It can pass really quickly when one's enjoying himself or in the company of really interesting characters. But time also seems to pass very slowly when a person finds himself in a dire situation. This was the case of Xavier at the moment. It had been 10 long hours since he had begun his watch and nothing eventful had happened yet. Crouched on his belly, with his eyes pinned to the sniper's scope, Xavier felt every painful second pass. His joints began to ache and his nerves began to stiffen. The worst part of it all was that it wasn't guaranteed that the leader of the goblins would turn up. The powerful stench of the goblin's urine didn't help matters one bit. Xavier comforted himself with the fact that the smell of the urine masked his own smell. It was to his advantage just in case the goblins were good at picking up and discerning different smells. So Xavier waited and waited. Finally, a couple of hours past midnight, Xavier chanced upon what he had been waiting for. A profoundly bigger goblin emerged from a hollowed-out cave with 2 smaller goblins by his side. It had the familiar majestic gait of a leader and the demeanor of a ruler. It towered above all the others in height, and the smaller vassals made way for him as he passed through them. All eyes were fixated him in awe. It was clear by the way the smaller ones acted that they respected him. Xavier didn't need anyone to tell him that this was his prize. This was the notorious chief of the goblins. His hunter-slash-killer instincts took over him immediately and a fresh new wave of energy surged through his being. As he peered through the scope with his finger on the trigger, he tried his best not to allow his excitement take over him. This was the thrill of the hunt. It was his reward for his patience and his unflinching resolve to see this through. This was what Xavier lived for. He took several deep breaths as his eyes followed the creature's every movement. He checked the wind's speed as well as its direction. After checking his equipment and the environmental factors, Xavier adjusted his breathing and locked onto his target. The tall goblin didn't realize that several meters away, an angel of death loomed over him with a gun pointed at him. Xavier didn't blame it for its ignorance though. There was no sign in the sky, neither was there any ominous anomaly in the stars that suggested that this was going to be its last moment alive. Much like every other night, this seemed like an ordinary night. Xavier sighed. This was always how it was for those who were marked out for death. No one ever really saw it coming. Xavier blanked out all other thoughts in his mind and focused 100% on the task at hand. With one eye closed, and the other eye pressed firmly on the scope of the rifle, Xavier let out one last breath and squeezed the trigger. It was common knowledge to every sniper at the period between when the trigger's been squeezed to the moment when the target drops, can seem like an eternity. The bullet flew from Xavier's lethal weapon with blinding speed, cutting through the air at supersonic speed. It struck down the target in less than a second. Xavier watched through his scope as the tall goblin slumped through the ground. Even though he tried his hardest not to, Xavier found himself smiling anyway. It was hard not to relish the success of a perfect kill. Even though he was a long way off, he could sense the commotion he had stirred in the midst of the goblins. The simple-minded creatures were shocked and they saw their leader slump to the ground when it was clear that no one had attacked him. They huddled together over his motionless body and simultaneously let out sharp cries when they saw the blood spluttering from the hole in his head where the bullet had penetrated. The pandemonium that followed was imminent. They began to howl and jump about in panic like mindless monkeys. The silencer had completely cancelled out the sound of the shot, so it was virtually impossible to tell if their weapon had been discharged or not. Completely in the dark as to what was going on, the goblins hopped around aimlessly. Panic was the order of the day. Their leader was dead and they couldn't tell what had happened. Their behavior was synonymous with that of doped-up monkeys. Their movements were sporadic, haphazard, and scattered. From his location, Xavier looked through his scope and watched the drama unfold before him. He had never seen such brainlessness in any group of creatures before in his life. It was indeed a rare sight. Well, this isn't my problem anymore. I guess I'm done here. He stood up and the first thing he did was stretch his ankles and elbows. Blood immediately began to flow through them after about 10 hours of lying completely still. He dusted himself and as he picked up his equipment to leave, he heard something that he wished he hadn't heard. Major Xavier Mace, this is the military system with a new set of instructions. Xavier froze. Dreading what would come next, he held his breath in anticipation. The system always came to him with new instructions at the worst possible time. Your new objective is to completely annihilate the band of goblins before you. They are to be completely destroyed. As soon as he heard the new mission from the military system, Xavier lost his temper and cursed aloud, "Damn you, you sick twisted system. What the hell?" Chapter 14 A Thick Cloud. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Xavier fumed like a wild bull. He was obviously enraged. Just when he had rounded up a mission that took him 10 hours, the system had chosen the very last minute to drop in a new mission. He was annoyed to the core. Xavier was sick of the way and manner with which the systems dropped in unannounced with annoying missions. He looked through his scope and knew that there were at least 200 goblins scattered across the plain. He cursed inwardly again. Damn it. Now I have to recalibrate my plans to accommodate all of this casualties. He wasn't happy with the new development one bit. He hated having to adjust his plans. Xavier was starting to get really annoyed with this entire mission and it irked him that he could do absolutely nothing about it. So, grudgingly, Xavier began to formulate a new strategy that would allow him to destroy the numerous goblins in the open plain. Prior to this very moment, before the systems had butted in with a new objective, Xavier's only concern was killing off a single goblin. And he had accomplished that beautifully with the weapon he had thought was best for the job. At the time, the sniper's rifle was the best weapon for the job. But right now, Xavier knew that it wouldn't be effective in a mission of this magnitude. What was required of him was mass murder. If he had a rocket launcher or a Hellfire missile, it would have been perfect. But right now, all he had was a single rifle and about 20 bullets in them. He contemplated using the same tactic from earlier on, but he knew that it would take a really long time to finish up. Sure, the goblins were all huddled together in one spot at the moment. But Xavier knew that if he decided to pick them off one by one with his rifle using his sniper's tactics, he would fail. It wouldn't be long before they all dispersed as the invisible enemy attacked them. As a sniper, he knew that the worst possible target he could have was a target that was aware of the danger he was facing. If the supposed target was fully alert, it would make it difficult for a sniper to execute his mission. Right now, his target was no longer just one single creature, his target was a group of fickle-minded creatures who were already on edge. A sneak attack with a rifle was no longer in order. He had to be more creative. Xavier remembered aptly what the old magician had spoken regarding the goblins' behavior when faced with an overwhelming force. The goblins would surely scatter and run for their dear lives. This would make it extremely hard for him to kill them all. Xavier knew he needed to keep them contained in one place. His sniper tactic wouldn't do much in the way of killing about 200 goblins. Even if he wanted to use his sniper, he wasn't sure he had enough bullets to kill 1/5 of the number. Whichever way he looked at it, he knew he was in a dilemma. He had to think and act fast now that they were still together in one place. So, Xavier began to brainstorm again. How could he kill 200 goblins without spooking of the rest? How could he accomplish this impossible task when his targets were more inclined to running instead of staying to fight? Xavier cursed the system again for putting him in such a precarious situation. He racked his brain again and again as he thought of the best and quickest possible way to end this impossible task. Come on Xavier, think. You've got this. Xavier had come out of impossible situations in the past before, but none was similar to this. His mind called to being some of his worst missions in the past and he tried to juxtapose some of them with his present situation, but he ended up coming up short every single time. Xavier knew he wouldn't be exaggerating this particular situation if he called it the hardest and the most difficult task he had ever been tasked with. It wasn't that the enemy he was facing was too strong, it was the mere fact that the intended objective of the mission was practically impossible given the current state of things. Xavier expertly realized that he was entertaining too much emotions at this time. So, he set aside all of his emotions and began to take in the whole situation with nothing but objectiveness. Like a set of dominoes stacked up neatly against each other, several factors began to arrange themselves in order as a brilliant plan formulated in Xavier's head. For the first time in a while, Xavier smiled at himself. It was the perfect tactic for an impossible situation like this. His confidence began to return as he went over the plan over and over again. He couldn't deny it, it was perfect. Much of Xavier's brilliant plan was heavily dependent on a lot of maneuvering. For his plan to work out perfectly, Xavier relied heavily on the one character flaw that was typical of goblins. Their cowardice and their tendency to lean towards disillusionment. While the goblins wailed on like immature puppies who had lost their mother, the lithe agile form of Xavier encircled them. He was clad head to toe in his black battle gear, so he slipped by undetected. Also, the strong stench of the goblin's urine, that had seeped through his clothing and clung to him, masked his own distinct human musk. So, it was practically impossible to detect him through his own smell. Almost as if nature itself was in tune with Xavier's plans, the heavy clouds that had been blocking the soft silvery rays of moonlight suddenly started to part. It was an extremely timely coincidence for Xavier. The happenings around him seemed to spur him on. Xavier reached into his supply kit and brought out the one thing that would gift him an added advantage: 2 canisters. To ordinary folk, it was simply known as tear gas. Xavier studied the terrain and expertly mapped out the best location to set off the tear gas. Still crouching low, he navigated through the woods and headed towards the slightly elevated ground that was north of the goblin's location. He stopped abruptly to listen for any sudden movements around him. When none came, he rose to his full height, shook both canisters vehemently and released the excited gas. The gas escaped from the containers with a loud hissing sound. He wasn't worried about the sound because the goblins themselves were more occupied at the time with their awkward wailing. Encouraged by the gentle wind that pervaded the night time, the thick smoke rose up like massive pillars before saturating the air over the clearing like a thick cloud. Xavier smiled as he watched the first stage of his plan come to life. It wasn't hard not to recognize the pride of an artist in his smile.l.rg. Chapter 15 Avenging Angel. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The first goblin to notice it began to shriek and jump around frantically. Instead of alerting the others, it continued its awkward and pointless fussing until the others soon picked up on the changes and joined in the pointless exercise. Their shock was only paralleled by their fear. Edged on by the sudden death of their leader, the goblins found themselves at an impasse. The resultant effect was much more than Xavier had hoped for. Before the nerve gas even hit their olfactory nerves, the already panicky goblins began to hop about, howling like monkeys in a frantic state. Unable to do anything, they looked on with horror as the strange thick smoke encompassed them like a malevolent deity. The childish goblins were unable to stay calm, so they quickly entered into a state of pandemonium. Soon enough, the tear gas filtered through the group and they couldn't help but breathe it in. The nerve gas hit their nostrils and the effect was instantaneous. The goblins found themselves coughing and spluttering as the gas ripped their lungs from the inside out. It didn't help that they were skipping about aimlessly. The more the move, the more energy they expended, consequently their need for more oxygen tripled by the second. The heavier their breaths, the more gas they inhaled. At that point it was obvious to them that they were totally screwed. So, the cowardly beings did the only thing they could. Weep. The volume of their chilling cries rang through the night like a death dirge. In addition to their already desperate situation, visibility became a real problem. While the gas assaulted their extra-large lungs, it also attacked their eyes violently. Blood soon began to spill from their eyeballs. Even worse for them was the fact that they couldn't see each other. Feeling alienated from the rest, each of them felt like they were alone in their own personal hell. A couple of smaller goblins writhed in pain on the ground while some of the larger ones clutched their throats as they struggled to breathe. Without the common sense or a leader to guide them, the goblins fell into a state of perpetual despair. It was chaos, and it was beautiful. They were now fair game. From where Xavier crouched down as he overlooked the goblin situation, he smiled again. Even though the major didn't want to admit it, deep down he seemed to be enjoying the hunt a little too much. His innovative thinking had taken full advantage of the current situation and it was proving to be very effective. If the first stage the appetizer, the second stage was the main course. Xavier slipped on his black ski mask and black hand gloves. It was time for the AOD to step out. AOD was an abbreviation that was used by the special forces on special missions like this. Its meaning was as ominous as its abbreviation. It simply meant Angel of Death. Other trained killers might recite a creed or an ancient text before going in for the slaughter, but not Xavier Mace. Merging with the darkness, Xavier filtered through the night with the terrifying stealth of an apex predator and executed the next stage of his plan. Blades. Xavier had always nurtured a very strange fascination for blades. But at this very moment, he didn't think he loved blades more than he ever did. Even while he had been in training, Xavier had always preferred the cold harsh steel of the Swiss Army knife to the regular grip of a solid handgun, rifle and machine gun. Blades gave Xavier the satisfaction and finesse he sought for in weapons. He absolutely adored the katana. He saw the long slender blade as an instrument to be danced with. But Xavier had already determined in his heart that if he ever found himself in the dance that was a fight to the death, he would call on his favorite set of blades. The legendary twin Arabian scythes. This was a set of wicked curved blades that were rumored to have been used by an ancient order of assassins. He had trained with them night and day for several years. And right now, he had found the perfect opportunity to showcase the fruits of the long years of training. Charged with a fresh new diabolic energy, like the mystical ninja of ancient times, the black-clad assassin took on the group of goblins single-handedly with nothing but a pair of twin blades. They never saw him coming. As the ideal hunter, Xavier started by picking out the weakest in the herd. He tiptoed around quietly in the thick fog of smoke, crept up behind the first one, struck out both of his hands in a scissors-like position and slashed the unsuspecting neck of the goblin. The poor creature didn't even have time to scream before the wicked curved blades sliced through both the external jugular vein and the middle thyroid vein. It slumped to the ground while clutching its sliced throat as blood came gushing out. Xavier felt no pity whatsoever for it. He had gone into killer mode and there was no stopping him. His quick sharp eyes rolled back and forth as he searched for the next victim that would fall by his blade. Xavier looked sinister as hell in his outfit. In addition to his already spooky black battle gear, he had on his very creepy gas mask that protected him from the suffocating smoke. His overall ambience was like that of a Death Reaper. The only thing that was missing was wings and a large wicked sickle. He hopped on to the next unfortunate goblin and struck it from behind with the exact same tactic. The goblins couldn't see, and because they couldn't see, it was impossible for them to fight an invisible enemy. In fact, their situation was so hopeless that they were yet to discern that they were actually under attack. With no leader to guide or coordinate them, they were like sheep for the slaughter and Xavier was the wolf. The smoke had practically rendered visibility and breathing impossible for the goblins, so Xavier pretty much had his field day with them. Slipping through the chaos, Xavier was killing at an impressive rate of 3 goblins per minute. He simply crept up from behind, sidestepped and slashed, crept up again from behind and repeated the whole dance again and again until he had virtually slaughtered over 1/3 of them. Xavier's senses were still tingling with diabolic excitement. This was absolutely what he lived for. Drenched in blood, and surrounded by the dead bodies of vile creatures, Xavier had never felt so alive than he was in that moment. The crowning glory of it all was the piling bodies that he left in his wake as he charged through the camp like an avenging angel. It was hard for him not to revel in the glory of the moment. Even after he had sliced open 100 goblin necks, Xavier was still far from tired. He tapped into his seemingly endless source of energy and blazed another deadly trail through a column of goblins with his blades dripping with reed-fresh blood. As he danced through the band of terrified clueless goblins, Xavier's blade sang in accordance with his movements. Xavier remembered what was the Caden had said about the goblins' intelligence being so low that an ordinary person could defeat them. It turned out that it was true. In about 10 minutes' time, the whole band had been slaughtered. Unfazed, the sinister figure that was Xavier, walked over to the corpse of the leader and cut off its thumb. That was all the proof he needed. Victorious, he turned back and headed towards the direction of the underground exchange. Chapter 16 Tacy, you are listening at novelfull.audio. The waitress who had handled the transaction the previous day with Xavier found herself in a dire situation. She wasn't in trouble, and yet, she was at the same time. Her present trouble wasn't of the domestic kind. Her present trouble was more primitive. It was the kind of trouble that kept her up through the night. It was the kind of trouble that kept her from being herself. It was the kind that kept her heart beating like a loud percussive instrument when the thought of the young stranger whom she had met only just 24 hours ago. Tacy was a relatively simple girl with extremely low self-esteem. She young bar maiden had completely fallen in love with the young mysterious teenager who had graced the underground exchange with his presence. The air of mystery around him had drawn her in like a magnet to metal. Though she had somehow managed to mask her true feelings when they had first met, internally, Tacy had been bursting with admiration for the young handsome lad. Long after he had left, his cold charisma and questionable charm bedazzled her. The memories of the way he handled his affairs seduced her mind away. There was simply no doubt about it. The young Tacy was stricken. She went about her daily chores absent-mindedly. Although she was physically present, her mind was several miles away. Her heart was centered on the young man. She allowed herself to dream and dream as she replayed the scene of their first meeting in her mind. How I wish I had made a move on him then. Maybe he would have had a lasting impression of me. Unfortunately for the young lover, she lacked the confidence and self-assurance that nature had endowed most women on the grounds of physical looks. Tacy didn't have confidence in her own body, so she couldn't make a move on Xavier at their first meet. It might also have been because of Xavier's extraordinary presence. She still remembered the mysterious aura that drew her to him. It was almost impossible to resist the pull that seemed to come from within him. Indeed, the mysterious teenager seemed to have his own center of gravity that made it look like everything around him gravitated towards him. Tacy remembered the way he moved and almost gasped out loud. Xavier moved like his feet barely touched the ground. It was like levitation. All of these thoughts crowded her mind as she swept the floor of the open space in the underground exchange. She was so caught up in the tumult of emotions raging in her heart that the sudden appearance of the man of her dreams completely took her by storm. She should have been to pick up the long shadow that darkened the ambience of the open space. But she missed that completely. The next sign was the sudden chill in the air that suggested a very cold presence had entered into the sphere of her orbit. Point me to where the old man is right away. So engrossed was she in her thoughts that the cold familiar voice startled her so much that she nearly jumped out of her own skin. She turned around abruptly to assault the stranger who dared to intrude on her personal space. All the anger melted away as soon as she saw the rugged handsome face of Xavier Mace. Her heart leapt within her as her gladness escaped from her heart and took on the form of a grateful smile on her face. Tacy was normally sharp-minded and vigilant, but today was just not one of her days. She was aware of the fact that Xavier had gone on a dangerous mission. Given the nature of her job, Tacy was more informed about the dangers of these kind of missions. She had seen several hunters go only to never return again. She had no doubt in Xavier's ability as a hunter, she knew he was more than capable of succeeding. But she had expected that it would take at least a week or more to complete his task. To see him back so quickly filled her with more joy than she could possibly contain. In her experience, a quick return usually meant failure on the part of the hunter. But Tacy honestly didn't mind. All she cared about was his safety. Every other thing could go to blazes as far as she was concerned. Although it looked like Tacy was blatantly ignoring Xavier's request to see the old man, in actuality, she wasn't. Like a lover who hadn't seen her heartbeat in a long time, Tacy's eyes pored all over Xavier's body. Her fear was that he had been injured. But the more she looked, the more she confirmed the fact that he was okay. Oh Xavier, Tacy thought to herself, I never for once doubted your skills. After a long disturbing pause, she finally regained her ability to speak. Xavier was an extremely patient guy, but he was glad when she spoke up and said, Welcome back Xavier. Tacy surprised herself at how high her pitch was. This was just one of the many things that had gone out of place in her body upon seeing Xavier. In order to rectify the problem, she adjusted her voice to sound normal. But unfortunately, she ended up overcompensating and deepened her voice a little too much so that she sounded like a man. Master Caden is indoors. Poor Tacy was embarrassed to the bone. She wished the earth could open up and swallow her whole where she stood. Xavier saved her from her embarrassment by ignoring the hell out her and walking straight to the front desk. Without any pomp or ostentatious movement, he then dropped the token which he had worked so hard to obtain on the counter. The ugly thumb of the chief of the goblins literally stuck out like a literal sore thumb. Without actually looking at her, Xavier issued her a new directive in a cold voice: "Tell Caden I am back." The mission was successful. Anyone observing Xavier might have easily ruled him out as melodramatic and prideful. The demeanor of the young man pointed towards those signs. But Xavier was just himself. He was a confident male, and it reflected in the way and manner he handled himself. At the moment, Tacy was completely mesmerized by that confidence which seemed to repel others. Her big brown eyes remained fixated on him in both admiration and shock. She left the chore she was handling and wandered over to the counter with her arms crossed across her chest as she gazed at Xavier in wonder. Chapter 17. So soon? You are listening at novelfull.audio. With her eyes wide open as if she had seen an anomaly, the young waitress stared at him like he was a monster or a mythical creature. She couldn't believe it, and yet the thumb which was on full display on the table suggested that he was in fact telling the truth. Tacy was baffled. This defied all logic as far as she was concerned. She had worked here for quite some time, so she had a clear picture of the statistical indices involved with missions and hunters. The goblin was a level 5 creature. And not just that, it was also a leader that was constantly surrounded by tons of goblins who lived to do its bidding. And yet, within a time so short, the young mysterious stranger managed to kill it all by himself and without even as much as a scratch. It was unbelievable. She just couldn't wrap her head around it. Even top hunters worked in groups, and needed at least a week or so to gather supplies, strategize, set traps and hunt a creature of this magnitude. There were so many questions on Tacy's mind. How did he pull it off? How did he manage to get supplies so fast? How did he even find the chief of the goblins so fast? All of these uncertainties plagued her mind. Because she was a curious person by nature, all of these questions were more like aches. Her curiosity soon got the better of her. She swallowed her guts and asked Xavier her most pressing question: "You are back so soon. How exactly did you go about the mission?" Xavier was actually surprised that she knew the details of his mission. He immediately assumed that Caden must have informed her for the sake of records. Either way, he wasn't much of a talker, so he simply shrugged his shoulders. But Tacy wasn't one that could easily be tramped down. Once she had set her mind on finding out any piece of information, it was almost impossible to stop her. So, she pressed on stubbornly, "But how did you break through? It is common knowledge that the chief is always surrounded by an entire herd of vicious goblins who would kill for him." Xavier wanted to point out the flaw in her statement. He wanted to tell her that the goblins' willingness to kill for their chief was diametrically opposed to their willingness to die for him. But he really was in no mood to talk. So, he replied her with as little words as he could: "Well, killing them all wasn't really a problem." Xavier's words dropped like a nuclear bomb on the ears of some hunters who were lounging nearby. Though they acted as if they weren't listening in on Xavier and Tacy's conversation, they were very much invested in knowing how Xavier had fared in his mission. Much like Tacy, they were thirsty for the information. But unlike the waitress, their gutlessness prevented them from coming over to ask the young stranger. A lot of them had been present in the establishment during the last showdown between Xavier and their champion. So, they didn't even dare to think that Xavier was simply showing off. Silently, they discussed among themselves, "Did you hear that?" The significantly younger one of the group was speaking now. Like the others, he had also been present at the time when Xavier had made a public example of the big bad wolf, the man whom Xavier had publicly humiliated. His colleague and fellow hunter replied him glumly: "Yeah bro. I did. It's almost unbelievable." "I know, should we go over and ask him if it's really true?" Annoyed by his question, he flared up and retorted, "Why are you asking me? Don't you remember what he did to the big bad wolf the last time?" There was silence for a while as each of them reminisced on the showdown that had happened only a day before. The young stranger had appeared to be boastful and haughty at that time when he had showed up with the bloody head of a cheetah claiming he had killed it all by himself. But he had proved them wrong after he had systematically dismantled the arm of their champion. The memory of the event was still very fresh in their minds. If they had taken anything from that experience, it was that they could never really doubt Xavier again. One of them spoke up and finally broke the uncomfortable silence. "I for one don't think he's lying, bro. I mean, look at the facts. This stranger seems to be pretty skilled." The others nodded their heads in approval. "You're right." A skinny one with broken teeth, and charred black lips from years of smoking, echoed verbally what the others were thinking. "No doubt, it doesn't really sound true at all. Imagine a single hunter killing 1 or 2 goblins. Now picture one man killing off tens and probably hundreds of goblins. It's almost unthinkable." Even as he spoke, he sheepishly kept turning back to see if Xavier was listening to him. His fear of the mysterious stranger was very evident. Someone else who was more reasonable in the group countered his point, "But given what we have all seen him do, I wouldn't put it past him actually killing off an entire group of goblins. What do you think?" The grumpy one replied wisely, "Well, he doesn't hunt with anyone, he possesses outstanding skills, and he turns up here with the decapitated of a cheetah as well, the chief goblin's thumb. I'd say avoid him at all cost." Their egos didn't permit them to accept this as the fact. But deep down, they knew that it was true. There was something about the young lad that was simply different. They couldn't tell with exactitude what it was, but deep down they could sense something extraordinary. They kept their distance from the young Xavier, but their eyes never left him for 1 second. Every single set of eyes remained fixated on Xavier like a group of hawks. Tacy on the other hand was actively struggling to process the information that Xavier had so casually dropped on her laps. How laid back he was about the whole thing enhanced his already mysterious aura. Tacy knew he wasn't joking when he had said that he had killed off an entire band of goblins just to get to their leader. Unable to bear the full weight of the news on her shoulder, she hurriedly dashed out in search for her boss. She knew he was going to want to hear that Xavier was back. As she glided through the hallways and turns in search of Caden, one thought echoed and re-echoed through her mind: Xavier. Just who are you exactly? In a matter of seconds, the hysteric Tacy arrived at Caden's door. Not even bothering to knock, she barged in and stopped only to catch her breath. Caden was already used to her discourteousness, so he wasn't startled one bit. Seated at his table and bent over a book, Caden looked at his employee questioningly with one eyebrow raised and thought, what could possibly be the issue with this one this time around? Impatiently, the old man rebuked Tacy and rasped aloud, "You had better have a good reason for barging in like this, Tacy." Still struggling to catch her breath, Tacy pointed her finger to the door behind her and mouthed one single word: Xavier. Chapter 18. Back. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The old magician instantly bolted upright at the mention of Xavier's name. Admittedly, he hadn't been expecting him back so soon. Immediately, he began to bombard Tacy with a barrage of questions. How is he? Was his mission successful? Damn it, answer me, woman. But Tacy was still trying to catch her breath. She wasn't exactly the athletic type, so it had been a while since she last ran. Use your words, Tacy. But she was taking too long to pull herself together. Caden decided he didn't have time to wait on her answers anymore. He could just simply see his new young hunter himself. So, Caden hurriedly got up from his table and gently shoved her aside as he headed for the door. Caden emerged in the waiting room/lounge in a jiffy. He didn't need to look too far before he found Xavier. Clad in black as always, the radically regal Xavier sat by himself at one of the tables as he stared off into space. A cold chill passed over Caden as he saw again the extraordinary blood-red aura that enveloped Xavier as he sat down alone. What Caden saw was like a sea of blood in the form of a thick fog encircling round about the young man. It was almost as if Xavier's bizarre aura had been enhanced since the last time they saw each other. It was extraordinary. In order not to seem too excited by Xavier's arrival, Caden slowed his initial pace and waltzed over to where Xavier was. A couple of hunters hailed the old magician as he walked across the room, but Caden ignored them all. He arrived at Xavier's table and greeted him. "Hello again, Xavier. Back so soon?" Xavier nodded. Caden chuckled softly. "Still chatty as always, huh?" Not waiting for a reply, Caden pressed on to the real issue at hand without any kind of foreplay whatsoever. "What's this I hear about you killing all the goblins? Is this true?" At this point, Xavier had grown tired of all the incessant bickering surrounding the killing of all the goblins. First it had been Tacy, then the other hunters, and now the old man was interrogating him on this very subject which he had already admitted to doing. His tone curt and super direct, he confronted Caden saying, "Look here, old man, if you want to confirm my claim, you are very much welcome to visit the goblins' territory and verify the truth for yourself. But do not sit there and doubt something that I have already been taken care of." Completely taken unaware and surprised at the young man's outburst, Caden could do nothing but sit in the chair opposite Xavier with a befuddled look on his face. Noel Duran he then proceeded to apologize to the younger man and showered him adulations in light of his recent accomplishment. The other hunters soon began to shoot respectful glances at Xavier in honor of his success. The whole mood soon changed as it began to get more celebratory. But Xavier boycotted the hero's treatment. It wasn't his style to seek out glory. He was a soldier first before all things. And soldiers obeyed orders and accomplished missions. Annoyed, the sleep-deprived and exhausted Xavier excused himself from the company of the old man and the other hunters. His first priority at the moment was securing a decent accommodation from which he could base his operations. But he didn't know the town all that well. Fortunately for him, fate provided him with a resourceful source of prime information. Just as he was headed out of the establishment, he saw the waitress from earlier on. "What is your name?" he asked. She replied shyly, "I am called Tacy." "Tacy, do you know where I can find a decent hotel in this town?" She opened her mouth to speak but held back her tongue as she took more time to further deliberate on the ideal answer. Finally, her eyes brightened and she answered Xavier gleefully. "This hotel in particular is called Orion's Belt. It's one of the best in the town." She noticed Xavier's lingering look, and she quickly added, "Oh, and it's perfect for strangers who are just visiting town, so the whole package is guaranteed." Xavier waited for her to give him directions, but it seemed that key detail had slipped through her well-prepared elaborate review of the hotel. Xavier coughed uncomfortably. "Can you point me in the direction of that hotel, please?" Tacy's face flushed with embarrassment as soon as she realized she had skipped over the part where she was supposed to give him the directions. She quickly tendered her apologies and did the needful. "1,000 apologies for that oversight, sir." She then proceeded to give him concise directions on how to locate the hotel. Satisfied, Xavier thanked her and bid her good night. Xavier wandered through the streets of the town and followed the instructions he had been given on how to locate the hotel. He had 2 sweet silver coins burning in his pocket, so he hoped it would be enough to secure him a decent room at the hotel. Sure enough, Xavier found the hotel the young girl had so aptly described. True to her word, the hotel had the elegance one would expect from the best hotel in a city. It was riddled with fancy art and medieval age architecture. Even in the daytime, it sparkled with the glitter and glamour of a top-rated hotel. Xavier wasn't interested in the aesthetics of the hotel. He simply wanted a decent place where he could retire and analyze the results from his recently completed mission. Xavier had no trouble checking in. He suspected that the hotel attendant had cheated him because he sensed that Xavier was a stranger. Also, it didn't quite help that Xavier had told him that all he had in his pocket was 2 silver coins. Xavier caught the avaricious gleam in the hotelier's eyes when he told him how much he had. It was at that moment Xavier knew he had messed up. The greedy hotelier wasted no time and immediately declared that 2 silver coins was the exact fee for a night and a hot meal. Xavier wanted to protest, but he was too tired to negotiate. All he wanted to do was simply rest. So he shrugged it off. After the fat man collected his coins hungrily, he beckoned to a porter to show Xavier to his quarters. A small cocky-eyed wimpy lad emerged and whispered nervously to Xavier, "Please follow me, sir. May I carry your baggage?" Xavier grunted no, he had seen this hustle one too many times before. The porter was simply trying to create a legal ground on which he could ask for a tip subsequently. But Xavier was already tapped out and he wasn't going to entertain any shenanigans anymore. After ascending a flight of stairs, they finally got to his room. The porter then proceeded to unlock the door and handed over the key to Xavier. Chapter 19 Let's roll. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Xavier opened the door without even bothering to look at the porter who was still standing awkwardly by the door. The young lad was rubbing his hands together and winking at Xavier, suggesting that he be tipped. Xavier banged the door in his face. He jumped into bed almost immediately after devouring the mini feast that had been laid out at the foot of the bed on a small tray. As was his custom after every mission, he began to analyze the outcome of his last mission. In his mind, he arranged the details neatly as though he was submitting a report to a superior officer. Mission: extermination of a herd of goblins. Total casualties: 185. Level of deceased goblins: multiple levels. Points gained: 2,569 points. Experience points: 100 points. Xavier reviewed the stats and immediately discerned that he could cash in that many points for a fresh batch of insanely powerful weapons. Nothing excited Xavier than new gear. The sweet smell of freshly delivered assorted weapons always excited him in a sick fashion. But he quickly suppressed his longings before he could act on them. At the moment, logic dictated that he didn't require powerful weapons. His surroundings had completely changed from what he was used to. What he needed more than anything was to immerse himself fully in this world and live like a normal person. He remembered his ever-present military system and cursed inwardly, "That damn system better give me a break from its crazy missions." After a long, tiring and eventful 48 hours that had been characterized by high-octane energy, Xavier finally drifted into a long sleep. When Xavier eventually awoke the next day, he was surprised to see that the sun had risen and was well across its way to the west. The soft satin sheets and fluffy pillows had done their magic. Xavier hadn't slept a full 6 hours since he came to this strange world, and even when he did manage to catch some shut-eye, it had never been for more than 3 hours at most. Also, he hadn't found a decent place to sleep in over 2 weeks, so understandably his body caught on to his new surroundings and immediately subscribed to the comfort that came with it. Xavier also found it amusing that this was also the first time in weeks that he hadn't jolted out of his sleep as a result of lurking danger. Well, it sure is nice to have a little comfort. Looks like the silver coins were well spent after all. Xavier stretched and allowed himself to relax fully in the new environment. There was no threat at the moment. There was no enemy. Xavier knew that the only thing that could disrupt the temporary calm was his trusty military system. He rolled eyes at the thought of the system. "I've got to watch myself. It's times like these when the stupid system pops up." Almost immediately, a knock came at the door. Xavier froze. The knock came again, this time more urgent. Xavier instinctively reached for his weapon on his bedside table and slipped out of bed. He never took off his battle gear even when he slept. He was always battle-ready at any given time. Xavier frowned as he mentally ran through a list of potential threats who would be bitter enough to seek him out. He knew that the only enemy that was desperate enough to trail him here was the guy whose hands he had decimated in the underground exchange. The person on the other end of the door knocked again. Xavier braced himself and tiptoed to the door. Prepared for whatever, he called out in a loud, clear voice, "Who is it?" There was a brief pause before a familiar voice came from the other end. "Sorry to bother you, Mr. Xavier. It's Tacy from the Underground Exchange." Xavier heaved a sigh of relief. It actually made sense that it would be her. The waitress was the only one who knew that he had lodged in this particular hotel, though it was a bit weird that she was here so early. He brusquely opened the door for the young girl and bid her to come in. She walked in and greeted him appropriately, "Good afternoon, Mr. Xavier." Xavier raised one eyebrow up. "Afternoon." He found it difficult to believe he had actually slept that long. "Good afternoon, Tacy. What brings you here?" Tacy stepped forward with the peculiar eagerness of a schoolgirl who had been sent on an errand. In her hand was a sealed envelope that clearly looked important. "I have been sent by my master to hand this over to you." With that, she handed over the package to Xavier, who received it cautiously. He observed the brown envelope curiously. It had his name inscribed on it with very fancy penmanship that was typical of 13th century writers. He looked at Tacy and questioned her on its contents. "What is this about, Tacy?" She shook her head and replied flatly, "It's clearly meant for you, Mr. Xavier. I have no knowledge or business with the contents." Xavier didn't miss the sass in her reply. As he took out his Swiss Army knife with the intention of breaking the wax seal, Tacy shifted back apprehensively. The quickness with which he had pulled out the knife caught her off guard, so she instinctively backed up a bit. In that moment, she had seen Xavier's dexterity with a knife and it remained in her memory. Xavier opened the envelope and saw that enclosed inside was a badge and a card. He read the text that had been inscribed in fine cursive handwriting. It was a kind of formal declaration or certificate that stated that he was now a level 6 hunter. To further lend credence to its legitimacy, scores of neatly stacked gold coins were added in the package as a kind of reward. Xavier looked at the contents and smiled to himself. This had the old man's hand written all over it. Well, I might as well make the best of this situation. Since the systems hadn't issued any new directives, Xavier knew that the next logical thing to do was to assimilate himself in the new society where he had found himself. But in order to accomplish that, he needed first-hand knowledge and experience on the doings of this new world that would help further his integration process. He had to learn about this new place. And who better to teach him than the young girl standing before him? "Tacy, would you mind joining me for lunch?" Totally caught unawares, Tacy found herself on the receiving end of a question she herself had been working up the nerve to ask Xavier. Shunning the rules of engagement, she ignored the societal norm of playing hard to get and gave him a favorable direct answer. "Sure. Wonderful. Let's roll." Chapter 20 Miss Mary. You are listening at novelfull.audio. A few minutes later, while the two of them shopped together, the talkative Tacy filled Xavier in on all he needed to know about the town. This town is called Sakita and it is right on the edge of the Marshar Empire. Because it is plagued by so many races that aren't human, several hunters troop here in search of the glory, thrill and gold that comes with completing quests. As she spoke, Xavier couldn't help but compare it Isekai from the Lord of the Rings trilogy. As they both entered a restaurant to eat, Xavier couldn't help but notice the stink eye that the people were giving him. Tacy nudged him. "Don't you think it's about time you change your outfit into something more conventional? It's giving people the creeps." Xavier agreed wholeheartedly with her. While they ate, Tacy engaged Xavier in a conversation. "So what's your philosophy of life, Xavier? What are your dreams?" Xavier swallowed a mouthful of catfish and answered her assertively, "I just want a simple life. I also want to live in a quiet place and live out my days with a simple woman." "That's pretty interesting. But you're obviously powerful, why don't you think of making a bigger impact with your strength?" Xavier shook his head disapprovingly. "Power is meant to be used to protect the weak. It isn't a gift to be wasted on selfish gain." All through their rapport, it looked like Tacy had been simply trying to make conversation with Xavier. Admittedly, she was a talkative who loved to school others and tell tales. But this time, her intention had been to find out just what type of man Xavier was. She had been extremely glad with the results she had gotten so far. It turned out that beneath the cold exterior of a killer, Xavier was a thoughtful and focused young man with a sound view of life. As the waitress cleared their plates, Tacy reminded Xavier of their initial plan. "I hope you haven't forgotten that we decided you are getting new clothes." "Wait, you mean like right now?" She rolled her eyes. "Of course, Xavier. It has to be right now. Do you really want to keep wandering around town looking like that?" "Well, if you say so. Where do you have in mind?" Tacy had just the right place in mind for Xavier's makeover. She couldn't take him to the main market because she sensed he hated crowds. So, she resolved to take him somewhere more reserved. A place where they could shop in privacy and away from the throng of people which Xavier found repulsively annoying. With a mischievous gleam in her eyes, she announced triumphantly, "The department store." Xavier looked at her questioningly like, "Is that supposed to mean something to me?" "Don't worry, Xavier, I will lead you there. It is close by." Xavier was indifferent about the whole situation. He wasn't too hyped about going shopping for clothes. But it was a necessary change that would enable him fit better in his new world, so he indulged the young girl. He paid for the meal and the two of them set out and headed in the direction of the store. 5 minutes later, and almost halfway to their destination, both Xavier and Tacy came upon a strange sight. Now it was evening and the day was gradually drawing to a close, so it was still kind of bright enough to see that people were gathered and huddled together, but it wasn't completely bright enough to see the main reason for the congregation on the street. They both shared the same worrying looks on their faces as they exchanged glances. As if in silent agreement, they both plunged into the crowd and began asking questions. Xavier didn't have much luck, but Tacy was a people's person. She melted through the crowd and quickly found the perfect group that were sure to be updated on the recent events. Tacy knew more than anyone just how much elderly women love to gossip. So, she approached the group of elderly women politely and greeted them, "Good evening, ancient ones." They chorused their greeting collectively in a sorrowful tone. Tacy took advantage of that and pressed on with her next question, "Forgive my ignorance, but please can you fill me in on why you all are so gloomy?" The shortest one in the center of the group wasted no time in taking up the opportunity to tell the tale. Clearly, she was the tale-monger in the group. The tiny woman with the long curved nose that resembled a beak began to fill her in. "Oh, it's a real tragedy," she began enthusiastically. "The case is a dire and sorrowful one because I personally knew the deceased." Tacy knew how to play the game well. She asked her a question that encouraged her to go on. "The deceased? Is someone dead?" She nodded vehemently, as she wiped pretend tears from her clearly dry eyes. Jealous of the fact that the shorter one was hoarding all the attention, one of the elderly women who had on an apron and smelled like freshly baked pastries took up the story from where she had left off. "Yes. Her name was Miss Mary, and she died under the most extenuating circumstances." "Was she murdered?" "Not quite. She hanged herself." Tacy was beginning to miss the short woman's narration. This one was clearly not great at reporting an incident. Tacy turned to fully face the first woman and inquired of her directly, "Madam, please tell me what happened. Why did she hang herself?" Glad that she was once again the center of attention, and also glad that the other woman had been shamed into silence, she began to narrate with vivid details the events that led to the death of the victim. "You see, the poor woman was raped by a whole band of orcs. These band of savage creatures were reported to have penetrated her both from behind and from the front till they had spilled every drop of their seed in her. It was a real mess of a situation. She bled for days on end non-stop." She allowed the bombshell to settle for a second before she continued. "But that wasn't all. You see, after she came home, her husband cast her aside because he thought she was no longer pure. So, with the stigma and the possibility of an impure half-breed abomination growing inside her womb, she took a rope and hanged herself publicly. Right around the corner up ahead." Tacy absorbed the news with lightning speed. She was sure that some parts had been exaggerated, but she had gotten what she needed. She quietly thanked the women and left. The second woman whom she had put down didn't answer her. Xavier had been listening in from a close range and was horrified by the incident.